Tigg Montague's Ponzi Pyramid Scheme by Hogan. He counted the stack of coins on his desk, sorting them as he did. The larger piles were a dull brown, some tinged with green, copper farthings, halfpennies and pennies, all well used. Of silver coins there were few. Of half-crowns there was but one. Carefully he noted the total up in his ledger and, leaning back, rubbed a bony hand across his chin and sighed. It was going to be a thin Christmas. The chests that had taken so long to fill had taken a far shorter time to empty. True, the contents were technically out on loan, and the repayment of even a small part would make him financially assured. But that wasn't the way it worked. What little came back went straight out again, the need far greater than his reserves. As for interest, some of the poor that he lent to were not in a position to pay even a penny in the pound. There was, it seemed, no profit in being good. Ebenezer Scrooge had a serious cash flow problem. "Humbug!" he cried, and an elderly dog staggered up from its place by the fire, coming to rest its head on his knee. The tattered ears, the hind legs at an awkward angle, spoke eloquently of a brutal life, until Scrooge had taken pity and rescued him. If at the time he had done so only to bring joy to a distraught Tiny Tim, nevertheless the dog had returned the favour and affection with more interest than any of his other investments. Tiny Tim, now thankfully not so tiny, the best and most expensive doctors in London having dealt with this, he was away at boarding school, and Scrooge's only relative, his nephew Fred, had emigrated with his entire family to America, the passage paid for with heavy heart by Uncle Ebenezer. Humbug was the most steadfast and loyal of his few companions. Although, as Scrooge's belly rumbled at the fading memory of his meagre repast, even that friendship could be sorely tested if his money and food ran out. Still, he contented himself. Look at what he had accomplished along the way, all in Marley's name, of course. Though as Marley had been dead these last 10 years, died 10 years ago this very night, it was perhaps obvious that the charitable deeds came from Scrooge's own hand, though few knew the reason why. The memory of his former business partner's chains, the life debt that Scrooge hoped he could in some way help pay off. And he had, hadn't he? Well, at least he tried. Why, only this morning he had saved another poor wretch and his sizable family fallen upon hard times, or harder than usual. Cold, hungry, but determined to live better lives, desperate to celebrate Christmas as it should be. He hoped his good intentions wouldn't be tripped up by gambling, drinking, and, alas, whoring. With every loan, Scrooge entreated the recipient to avoid any and all spirits. But he'd already had to write off a disturbing number of debts and had thrown good money after bad to keep the poor that crossed his path out of prison and away from the workhouse. Perhaps there were sounder investments, but he balked at that, as it was so obvious his wealth could only do so much good elsewhere. How could he stand by when many thousands were in want of common necessities, hundreds of thousands in want of common comforts, such as Mr. Jones and his indeterminate number of dependents? Why, the man had been so distraught, he seemed to forget exactly how many children he had, and their ages, and their names. Scrooge had felt a flood of sympathy for the man, obviously unused to pleading his plight. And though it had left his purse severely lightened, he had pressed what coins he could into the man's grimy hand, wishing him a Merry Christmas and a more profitable New Year. And then he'd watched, anxiously, as Mr. Jones had crossed the yard to the local tavern and disappeared into the smoky rooms within. No, there had been some successes, he supposed. Companies kept afloat are now positively booming, from Todd's Barbers to Mrs. Lovett's Pie Shops. Even his one-time clerk, Bob Cratchit, was now an up-and-coming businessman, a beneficiary of Scrooge's generous patronage. But these were advances to tradesmen and professionals, men and women who knew the value of hard work and sobriety. For the rest, his loans had spectacularly failed to lift them out of their poverty. It was shocking how many of those came to him, cap in hand, telling their desperately familiar tales of woe, ended up being knifed in a bar brawl, a scant day or so after he had given them a generous long-term loan, on virtually no interest, money which would never be replaced, or not in this life anyway. And so, a scant 3 years after his Yuletide epiphany, things were beginning to look rather bleak. Odd to remember that moment of giddy exultation, the almost drunken feeling of relief in rediscovering his festive cheer. The sensation had quietened down to a benevolent generosity as the years rolled by, only to flare back into life each Christmas time, inspiring ever grander acts of charity. Not this year, though. Desperate times were upon him. The sound of the oversized door knocker reverberated through the old house like thunder, startling Scrooge out of his reverie, sparking a feeling of ominous dread. But it wasn't the ghost of Jacob Marley on the step. It was Bob Cratchit, dressed in a sharp new suit and cravat, an ebony walking cane in one hand, and in the other, a page of cheap print, the rough paper mottled, the letters badly set, the crudest of publications. "I thought you ought to see this, Ebenezer." Scrooge took it for a song sheet at first, the sort that were traded in the street for 3 a penny. But as he read, his brow creased. "What is this, Bob?" "Instructions." "Instructions? For what?" "For getting the best terms on a loan from you." "But that's all there. The trigger phrases, the ideal number of kids, not so many that the case appears hopeless, but enough and young enough to tweak at your heartstrings. A family fallen upon hard times, an appeal to one more fortunate, the assurance that if they can just be helped out just this once, they'll be able to turn the corner and live a more honest and profitable life. Oh, with special appeals for winter and, of course, for Christmas." "I'm being played?" Scrooge said in disbelief. "I assumed you knew that," Cratchit said, eyebrows raised. "I wanted to know that, make sure that you knew the industrial scale of it." Scrooge went to bed that night thinking unseasonably dark thoughts. He'd read and reread the page of instructions, comparing them to the appeal by Mr. Jones, presumably not his real name, not if the first transaction had been followed. A surprise, then, to find at the bottom of the sheet a brazen signature of its author, one Montague Tigg, a notorious ne'er-do-well, as responsible as any pub landlord for the crushing poverty of his fellow man. As he contemplated cold revenge, the bell tolled once, and a spectral figure thickened at the gloom at the end of his bed. "Scrooge," intoned the ghastly ghost, "we hoped we were done with you. We thought we'd turned you to the light. Are you having doubts?" "Yes," admitted Scrooge. "Tush, and you one of our success stories. What ails you, man? Scrooge edged to one side, trying to look behind the apparition's dark cloak. Are you on your own? He asked. Oh, yes, and we're all on double shifts. It's a busy night. But you can speak. Why, that I can, said the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Though with first visits, it's more dramatic if I don't. It's all about the drama, the shock to the system, you can. Plus, my accent. Well, anyway, I am glad that you are here. Are you? The ghost said doubtfully. You see, I have a few questions. Mr. Scrooge, now that isn't the way this goes, and you know it. Bah, tell me, ghost of the future, look into mine. 6 months from now, do I continue to do good? There was a moment's silence, and the spirit sucked in its breath. Ah, I see. Is it as bad as I feared? Worse. Much worse. Oh dear, that you should come to this. The spooky figure shook its head, bones rattling as it did. Oh, but that's just one possible future, isn't it? Scrooge said, sitting up tall. They're not fixed. I mean, you showed me that. Well, yes. So, show me a better future. It doesn't quite work that way. The horse races, perhaps. Who wins the next derby? Mr. Scrooge, what you ask we cannot, we will not do. I mean, it's hardly ethical now, is it? Why, I might as well tell you to clear out of railway stocks, or teach you the dark arts of pyramid insurance scams, or Ponzi schemes. Ponzi schemes? Well, what are they? You're missing the point, Mr. Scrooge. We're forces for good, not for the light. I'm not going to see you come back to being the mean old miser that you once were. Nor would I, Scrooge said. Mankind is my business now. Rest assured, I will continue with the charitable deeds. Well, that's as may be, which I can hardly do if I'm in the poorhouse now, can I? Well, 'tis most irregular, but there's some sense to what you see. It's the rich and the greedy who tend to fall foul of these dastardly schemes. But there you go then. Think of it as a Robin Hood tax. Money taken from the rich and given with a judicious hand to the poor. And if you're in any doubt, look again to my future spirit. The one where you tell me about these financial irregularities. And see that I am true to my word, that I continue to freely share what comes my way. What say you? In his fireside bed, Humbug stirred, chasing rats, for he knew nothing of rabbits. Life was good, getting better. Visited by his own ghost that evening, he'd seen visions of walks in foreign lands. His master by his side. He couldn't understand what Scrooge talked about on these long walks. Subprime mortgages and dot-com bubbles, long-term capital management and Enron, Black Wednesday and Brexit, nor why Scrooge now traded under a new, seemingly respectable name, Tigg Montague. But that really didn't bother him. The sun warmed his old bones, and the rich men, his master, now seemed to visit regularly, and they seemed awfully keen to make friends with Humbug, patting his head and offering him tidbits from the table, as if by winning him over, they may somehow win over his master as well. Humbug wagged his tail in his sleep. The tidbits were rich, no richer than the marrow-filled bone he now knew Scrooge had bought him for Christmas Day. So, there you have it. As we lurch from financial crisis to financial crisis, it seems Scrooge, or his ghostly visitor, has rather a lot to answer for. And God bless us, every one.